Welcome. My name is Emily Newman, and I am the AHA Senior Education Coordinator. Tonight, we've got for the American Humanist Association's Critical Mind series, this wonderful program on reproductive justice and intersectionality. Dr. Colleen McNicholas, Chief Medical Officer at Planned Parenthood of the St. Louis region and Southwest Missouri, as well as Pamela Merritt, Executive Director of Medical Students for Choice. So thank you both for coming to talk to us, and look forward to your talk as well as some Q&A afterwards.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen, and then Pamela is going to kick us off here.
There it is. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us and for this opportunity to present with Dr. Colleen on reproductive justice and intersectionality. This is an intro to the reproductive justice framework and how we use and apply intersectionality to advance human rights and to dismantle reproductive oppression. I'm very mindful that we are about to begin this just as our country heard in the world heard the verdict in the Chauvin murder case. And I want to ground this session in the fact that regardless of the fact that there's finally accountability in this case, that I'm incredibly mindful that there are multiple families that had to carry the burden of losing a loved one, of having a horrific crime take place in front of their children and their loved ones, and that the work that we do is work that is fighting to advance and ensure that everyone has the human right to determine whether or not to parent, to have the supports from their community to raise their families, and to be able to live in communities that are free of violence and oppression. Sadly, that did not happen. And so we have not had justice, but we have had accountability, and we need to move forward and definitely not settle for anything short of true justice. So moving along, why us? So I am Pamela Merritt, and I am the Executive Director of Medical Students for Choice. Prior to joining Medical Students for Choice in January, I was the co-founder and co-director of Repro Action, which is a direct action organizing group that formed to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. I am also a Planned Parenthood affiliate in Missouri, alumna, and very proud to do this work so often. I'm so lucky with Dr. C and so many other wonderful physicians and providers in our network. I'll kick it over.
Thanks, Pamela, and specifically for sort of starting our session by grounding us in what is the reality of today and the lived experiences of so many across this country. So my answer to why us is different than Pamela's, and I think for obvious reasons, right? So I am a white woman physician, and so I enjoy a whole host of privileges that sometimes make it difficult for folks to come to an understanding or a practice of justice and intersectionality. So my story is one of continued evolution and growth. And it really is a story of my journey to find the real place or the right place where medicine can help really bring about healing and health. And I say that coming from and recognizing that I come from a system of training and education that specifically I'm advocating now sort of to change and dismantle and disrupt. And so so my story is different. It is really a story of figuring out how I use the multitude of privileges that I am afforded to really change healthcare delivery, and specifically in the space of sexual and reproductive health. So I'm excited because I do assume that some of you are at least in the same space that I am. And I specifically call that out because for me, it really has been a journey. I started in a place where I didn't know anything about this or understand this. And so I say it both to acknowledge the reality for folks and also to say that there is definitely a way to move and to have greater understanding and to affect change in a more global and intersecting way.
Thank you so much. So before we dive right in, I think it's important, we think it's important to kind of ground ourselves and level set about, to get our heads in the right space before we approach what can be some challenging topics and issues for people to digest. So the first thing I want to say is I want to invite all of the attendees to open your minds to concepts that you might not be familiar with, or that you might have heard misrepresentations of. I want you to open your mind to the reality that your lived experience is not everybody's lived experience, and that your experience within healthcare and your experience within the world might not be the same as somebody else's experience, and that we are within the reproductive justice movement, we are organizing by centering the most marginalized within our communities. Sometimes that's not you. The other thing is that I invite everybody on this, listening to this video, to allow yourself to be challenged. I am a firm believer that growth comes from leaning into moments where we're not exactly comfortable, where we're not exactly sure-footed. As a former tennis player, I can attest that you have to be really bad at tennis for a long time before you get good at it. And you have to be comfortable learning. And that's true in so many parts of life. It's certainly true when we're talking about movement work that is working to dismantle oppressive systems. If it's not making you uncomfortable, it's probably not going to dismantle anything. And then the last thing I want to say is that we do need people to think differently if we're going to make change. If we don't think of things, if we aren't open to receive a completely different narrative, then we will continue to do the exact same thing. That requires a lot of courage. It requires daily inner work, and it requires checking in with people who are most impacted by oppression, but also calling in people who we care about, who might not necessarily stay on the path. People are human, and so we want to make space for people to make mistakes and grow, as long as that is done in the pursuit of growth and education.
Thanks, Pamela. So as we think about the next 40 minutes or so, this is sort of the framework and how we're going to move through today's talk. So the first thing we will do is give just sort of an overview of, I think, the frameworks that came before, right? Or still inform and still ground us in the work of justice. So a brief overview of the human rights framework, as well as the justice or social justice framework. And then we're going to introduce some of the newer concepts around intersectionality. And maybe intersectionality isn't necessarily new for you, but I, even as somebody who talks about it and thinks about it intentionally all of the time, I still find that almost every day there are ways that I'm thinking about this in a new way, as we're confronted with more and more injustices in our world. We'll do a really quick, we're not going to perseverate on the old way, but I do think it's important to call out the old way of looking at sexual and reproductive health as a rights or a health framework. And then Pamela's going to take us through the reproductive justice framework and give us that real basic sort of what is that framework look like and why is it so important. And then we're going to end with sort of where we think the magic is, which is the combination of that reproductive justice framework overlaid with a real deep understanding of the importance of intersectionality and how, when used together, those two things really can be a winning recipe for making some significant changes towards justice in this country and beyond. So I'm going to start with the sort of global, most broad framework, and that's the human rights framework. And most folks are probably familiar, at least on some level, with the human rights framework. So it came really out of some work at the United Nations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was actually drafted with the participation of a diversity of different folks from across the globe and across specialties. Certainly there was lots of legal mind representation in this work, as it then became part of sort of legal human rights and civil rights treaties and doctrine throughout the country. It was first introduced in the UN in 1948. In fact, it was December 10th. And I remember that because that is my birthday. So my birthday every year is celebrated as the International Day of Human Rights. So that's exciting for me and anybody else whose birthday is December 10th. But really what it did was set sort of the common standard that all people in all nations do have some rights that cannot be, and human rights that cannot be taken or given away by any government or individual, and that these areas of human basic rights exist in all areas of our lives, in our civil life, in our political life, in sort of the economics and financial security of our life, in our social spaces and in our cultural spaces. And really the sort of grounding and fundamental principle that came out of the human rights framework that we then use in our sort of justice work every day is that not only are these rights present and there and sort of acknowledged in this doctrine, but these are independent, each of these are independent and indivisible. They don't depend on each other. This is actually a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt, who is holding one of the first printed drafts of this, this declaration document. But the declaration itself includes 30 articles. And as I said, they span a whole variety of topics. Topics that are pretty basic and seem really obvious, things like prohibition on slavery, but also some things that are not necessarily maybe as evident, like the human right to have work that you choose, the human right to enter and leave a marriage freely and to create a family in the way that you see fit. Each of these articles, however, does sort of focus on the universal character of an individual person as inherent, inalienable, and applicable to all human beings, regardless of where you live.
And with that, I'll pick it up with the justice framework. So the justice framework is one that is about social justice activism, and probably one you're really familiar with. A lot of, when I think of it in terms of the environmental justice or some of the civil rights justice work that you might have been familiar with in the 60s. A good example is that the justice framework, it was used in Brown v. Board of Education, which was basically saying that Black students in segregated schools weren't getting equal access to education. It was also used by a lot of advocates and disability and disabled advocates who were pushing for the ADA, so that they could have equal participation, similar activism for equal participation for disabled folks in public education. It is built on pursuit of equity and also on human rights. And it applies to repro rights, healthcare access, education access, employment discrimination, voting, and disability. So I love these pictures. I'm a very visual person, and I'll be honest, I don't think I quite got it until I first saw these pictures. I hope that y'all are seeing them very well on the screen. So equality is the assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports, and thus they deserve equal treatment. Equity is that everyone gets the support they need. And that might be different for me than it is for Emily, than it is for Colleen. And justice, all three of those people in the picture can see the game and have the supports and accommodations because the causes of inequity were addressed. The systemic barrier has been removed. Rather than adjusting and putting a temporary fix in place, they've achieved justice. So intersectionality is a tool, and I like to explain how it applies as follows, that we are currently coming through a time of great resistance and organizing against oppression, but that is not a fixed position. Nobody wants to be in a constant state of resistance. So intersectionality is a tool that we use, that human rights, that liberation is our goal, and human rights is what that looks like. So when you look at the list that Colleen went through, that's what it looks like when you've achieved human rights. Intersectionality is a critical tool that we use to make sure that that we are achieving justice, and not the middle part of that bar, not just equity, that it is a permanent or monumental, substantial change is being made when we advance our movements, when we propose policy, and when we take action in the streets. So there are a billion million different ways that people might experience discrimination or oppression. In reproductive justice, we view all of these as part of reproductive oppression, but it's what intersectionality challenges us to do is realize that you might have privilege in some space and not have privilege in other parts of your identity. I find that this can be the most challenging area for folks, but it is also, as I said earlier, probably the area that people need to lean into the most. That if your gender expression provides you with privilege, that does not mean that your sexual orientation might not provide you with areas of discrimination. We saw it a lot with marital status, when you had people who might be affluent in parts of the LGBTQ community, but they were being oppressed because they weren't able to access thousands of rights through legal marriage. It could be location, it could be age or culture. And what I love about intersectionality is that it challenges us to think and at least acknowledge all of these intersecting ways that people experience oppression. And if we center the most marginalized and we build our solutions and our policy and our movements around liberation and lifting them up to seek liberation, then everybody else is going to be good. So it really is about strategically looking at what we're advancing and making sure that it's not leaving the people that we say we want to stand with in solidarity behind.
Thanks, Pamela. I really love this slide because for me, it is a really important demonstration of how my practice of medicine really changed once I had a better understanding of this concept. I started to ask patients different questions. It wasn't just about your periods being too heavy, right? It was about, what does that look like for you in the setting you live? What does that look like for you in your larger culture? What does that look like for you in work disruption and taking the bus, right? This approach really is an opportunity to think about not just the outcome, but the why of the outcome. And as I think you have demonstrated now with a couple of slides, it is through addressing the why that we really get to the justice outcome and not just the Band-Aid fix. So I love this. And I don't think that there is a slide that could fit enough bubbles on it to get all of the things that we should be thinking about. But to your point, people present to their healthcare experience, experiencing privilege in some of these and oppression in others. And that's just an important thing for me, at least as a healthcare provider, to remember as I'm helping them sort of in their quest for health and happiness. So I'm going to take on sort of the old siloed way of thinking. So I actually entered, I will tell you, I went to medical school and very early on knew that I was going to be an abortion provider. But I was very much, at that point at least, trained to understand the issue of abortion in this sort of way, in this very siloed understanding of reproductive health and rights as a choice issue, as a fundamental problem with some people having access. And by access, I mean the ability to choose to have a pregnancy or not have a pregnancy. Which is very different than what we'll be talking about here in just a few minutes. But this old siloed way of thinking is what has created, I think, multiple justice movements that, at least until recently, really were operating independently. So there was a coalition of folks who were working on choice. There was a coalition of folks who were working on immigration rights, and a coalition of folks who were working on criminal justice, and a coalition of folks who were working on pay equity. But really, what I hope that you are starting to hear and think about is how, at least as I think about it, I have one patient who is undocumented, needing an abortion, who is incarcerated and wasn't getting paid what a male counterpart was making for that same job. And so for that patient, their lived experience, their life intersects all of those silos. And so that's the place we're moving from to a more justice-centered way. So let's talk about those two sort of old approaches to choice. And the first lens is what I usually call just the repro health lens, right? This is sort of that social justice advocacy that says, reproductive health disparities and inequities are important, and we need to address those in marginalized community, really focusing on service delivery. How do I get prenatal care to an underserved area? How do I get abortion access to that zip code? And it does take into account all of the sort of demographics that we think of, right? That social justice approach does have some understanding that race, age, sex, gender, geography, ability, your socioeconomic status, those things do have an impact on health and health outcomes. But the repro health lens is very focused on the service delivery. What is the health care that I'm trying to get to that person? The reproductive rights lens, which oftentimes works in parallel with that reproductive health lens, is much more focused on the legal rights of somebody to have an abortion or to continue their pregnancy. So this really focuses on particularly that sort of litigation piece, the what does the law say? And I'll take this opportunity to remind everybody that your right to abortion is really grounded in a legal decision about privacy, which most folks, I think, don't necessarily understand, right? That it's not actually at all about pregnancy or about healthcare. The initial Roe decision was all about actual privacy. And so it doesn't take much to sort of see how both of those approaches really fall far short of fixing the problem, instead of bringing everybody to a place of better access, more justice, being able to really live in this reproductive justice framework. So the better way is what Pamela is going to talk to us about. So it is not that I think that we need to completely eliminate the reproductive health lens or the reproductive rights lens. Obviously, all of these things intersect and are still important, especially in our current landscape where it seems like we're litigating any number of different laws and regulations that are passed and enacted around reproduction and abortion. But there is a better long-term approach to really fixing this, and that is reproductive justice.
Thank you very much. So it's important to acknowledge that reproductive justice was developed and created as a definition and a framework by Black women who had gone to Cairo for a conference in the 1990s. I believe it was 93. At that conference, they heard a lot of what Colleen was just talking about. They heard a lot of choice language. They heard a lot of siloed presentations and solutions. And these Black women were feeling very disconnected from what was supposed to be a very inspiring and connecting conference. They came back to Chicago and they met up. I like to envision that they were all like in somebody's house with really funky herbal tea and really just coming together. And they gave us, these mothers of reproductive justice, this framework, and it began as the African American Women Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance Caucus, and has since birthed some of the strongest national organizations that we have. And I personally feel that the reproductive justice is really sourced, it lives at Sister Song, and they really do help us figure everything out. Reproductive justice is the human right to decide if and when you will have a baby and the conditions under which to give birth. It is the fighting and advocating and organizing to ensure the human right to decide if you don't want to have a baby, and to have the options for preventing or ending pregnancy. And it is about organizing and advocating and living a life that is fighting for people to have the human right to parent the children that they already have, with the necessary social supports in environments and communities that are free of violence and oppression. The intersectional theoretical analysis, I say that 10 times fast, behind all of this is that this is a human rights framework that is applicable to everyone. And that the reproductive justice framework is based on concepts of intersectionality and the practice of self-help. It's talking about things in terms of what, beyond merely saying that we need to have a legal right to abortion, but that we need to have access to abortion. That means the number of clinics that we have. That means the number of barriers that we have to navigate to access medication abortion. It could be the fact that Medicaid should cover abortion, that all insurance in abortion should be covered in every single way. Not just in worst case scenarios for the pregnant person. Access gives us a far broader range for the issue of abortion than simply using a choice model. It's a base building strategy that requires multi-issue cross-sector collaborations. If you are into politics and you were watching what happened in Georgia during the 2020 election, please know that that was intersectional organizing, and that reproductive justice organizers and organizations were at the head of it. Some of the people that we know very well on TV are intersectional organizers and had been working in Georgia for over a decade to build that base that basically saved democracy. And it worked, as we all said it would, because it brought a diverse, multi-issue coalition to the table, built out of respect and not out of what I can get out of you. Not asking for somebody's vote based on desperation, but true collaboration. And then reproductive justice also offers a different perspective on human rights violations. It challenges us, it challenges me, even after a decade of doing this work, to examine and question how our bodies are controlled and how we are viewing the systems that are controlling our bodies and the destiny for our families and our communities, which is best understood as reproductive oppression. When we put this, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, we're going to now try and put this into practice. So I like to say, certainly we've all heard practice makes perfect, but I don't believe that that's true. I do think practice makes progress. And it brings an understanding that work is actually really instrumental and required for change. It creates new habits to up our skills and helps us build our confidence so that we can then show up in other spaces that maybe aren't obvious to us and talk about abortion. So we don't get to see you in person. So we don't get to do this fun part of the talk where we ask the audience about how comfortable they are advocating for example, climate change or climate justice, and everybody raises their hand. And then we ask you, how comfortable are you in that same space talking about why abortion access or reproductive justice should have a seat at the climate justice table? And that's when nobody raises their hand, because it doesn't seem obvious at first. But with some practice, with, again, some real thought around the intersecting nature of our lives, that is the space that we want to bring you to, where you feel confident showing up to all of these justice movements with an eye towards reproductive justice. So I'm going to start with the super easy one to get us sort of started off the bat, which is economic justice. So as Pamela said, what is choice if you don't have economic power? Now, I could spend probably hours giving you examples of patient stories for each of these spaces that we're going to talk to, but we don't have that much time. So I will say this, that, nearly every patient that I take care of seeking an abortion cites some sort of financial insecurity as part of the story, part of the reason that they present for that abortion. And so what does that mean to us? That means that when there is a fight for raising the minimum wage, reproductive justice should be at the table. Because if what's driving you to choose abortion is that you don't have financial security, the solution is bringing financial security. The same is true when we talk about affordable childcare. There are places across the country, and many of you probably feel this every day, where if your choice is working a minimum wage job or paying for childcare, it doesn't make financial sense to work and pay for childcare. And so obviously that puts us in a place where childcare is a fundamental reproductive justice issue. And of course, there's the obvious equal pay for equal work. So things like Title VII, for example, pregnancy protections in the workplace, the Equal Pay Act, paid family leave. Those are some of the more obvious ways that I think economic justice and reproductive justice intersect. But it hasn't been until very recently that the reproductive justice folks have been loud and proud and at that table. And so this is one, I think, pretty straightforward, simple way of showing that two justice movements must be working in alignment. Okay, I'll take on the next one, which is maybe not as obvious for folks. So immigration status is a reproductive justice issue. And I can give you a handful of examples just from the last year or two. So many of you have probably heard of the nearly 60 women who were in immigration detention centers at the border who reported that they were coerced into having hysterectomies. So those are fertility ending procedures. That is an obvious reproductive justice issue. Maybe less obvious, though, is when you think about how the impact of being undocumented in this country, what that has on sort of your day-to-day life. So what I have heard from lots of patients who are fearful of their immigration status is it makes them much less likely, in fact, so unlikely that it's really rare to report incidences of domestic violence, for example. Any interaction that might bring them to the attention of law enforcement is essentially avoided. So what does that mean for their reproductive health and life? It means lots of women, lots of folks are presenting for pregnancy termination in situations of domestic violence or abuse that are unwilling or unable to get resources for that. That's a reproductive justice issue. Many of those same folks who may continue the pregnancy are unable to access prenatal care for the same reason. So we have now, by virtue of making immigration status something that folks are so fearful of, we have now by de facto made that a reason for folks to not seek prenatal care, making their pregnancies less healthy and potentially impacting pregnancy and birth outcomes. That's a reproductive justice issue. So immigration is maybe a little less obvious than pay equity or economic justice, but nonetheless, there are so many examples of how immigration status, just like immigration justice, just like economic justice, is a real reproductive justice issue. Okay, you go, Pamela.
Thank you. And I will warn that my dogs are coming into the room, so I apologize if there's any beagle barking. Political representation is most certainly a reproductive justice issue. We believe that everybody has a human right to be represented and to, no taxation without representation has been drilled into our heads. But when you think about lived experience and whether somebody truly represents where you come from, your experience, and even understands the challenges, but also the joys of your background. We have a big problem, not just in our federal government, but in our state and local governments as well. When you can really tell the difference when you look at how we're discussing infant and maternal mortality in the state of Missouri, where Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die as a result of pregnancy complication in the first year after giving birth, and trying to get that amplified with policymakers is challenging. It's getting easier because representation is expanding. And so when people think about where are the hurdles to dealing with reproductive justice and poor birth outcomes, a lot of them are political, and a lot of them are based in the fact that the people who hold political power have no idea what it's like to live as a woman of color, as a Native woman, as a trans Black person. Gender and sexuality are also reproductive justice issues. The fact that when I began this work 12 years ago, I was actually talking to somebody who couldn't find an OBGYN to even begin a conversation about fertility because they had the legal right to say they wouldn't see somebody who identified and was trans. That is absolutely horrific when you think about the way that health insurance works and how people are able to even access doctors. But we are really starting to see vibrant discussions about what providers and physicians need to know about the wonderful spectrum, the lack of limits on gender and sexuality, but we also know that there are some really bad outcomes that have happened. People who have not had, ovarian or cancer treated because they weren't able to find a provider. We believe that you have a human right to healthcare, and you certainly have a human right to build families, and that shouldn't be something that is out of touch based on providers' discrimination. But there are actually pieces of legislation floating that would protect people being discriminated against. And then obviously, police violence is a reproductive justice issue. More often than not, it is talked about in terms of denying families or mothers their right to parent their children. I also think it's important that people understand that police violence impacts people, as Colleen said, in multiple different ways. Sexual assault and sexual harassment is the number two the second most common police misconduct complaint that is filed. The more marginalized an individual is, the more likely that is to be a rampant situation. So it extends into undocumented people, but also sex workers, trans folk experience a level of oppression by police that is really not well documented, and certainly is not being addressed. And then we also have the violence against Black and Brown women who are experiencing the toxic stress of raising children or trying to decide whether to have children in a society where where people often shrug at Black children being brutalized, being terrorized, being harassed, and losing their life. As a Black woman, I have had this conversation with far too many people, and it is painful, but it is definitely the connection of police violence and reproductive oppression.
Thank you, Pamela. So now I know we only have a few minutes left. So those were some of our sort of examples walking you through the different justice movements and how they intersect with reproductive justice. We obviously are putting forward that we believe that intersectional reproductive justice is the fix, but we really didn't tell you what we were fixing yet. And so we're going to spend the last few minutes just giving you that sort of overall broad understanding of what's happening right now in this country with access to abortion. And we're going to use abortion, in this setting, but again, recognizing that reproductive justice is not an isolated issue of abortion. It is obviously much broader than that. So I'm going to start with just some of the overall trends. So we actually have seen an overall decline in abortion over really since 1980, and that continues to be true. We think that that's probably because of a variety of reasons. Most likely, the largest driver of that is the increased access to and use of contraceptive methods, particularly some of the longer term or less user independent methods. So it is, I point this out specifically because I think that when we think about abortion and sort of the popular media and the things that are sort of drilled into the head of folks who don't live and breathe abortion all day long, one might believe that abortion is on the rise, or a variety of other myths that might be sort of floating out there. But the reality is that the rates of abortion have continued to decline over time. And that's true of all age groups. But what about abortion patients? So who are folks who are accessing abortion? And I put this up here because, again, I think we want to sort of drill into your head that the intersection of who abortion patients are is what should drive your advocacy and where you show up in spaces and how you advocate for reproductive health rights and justice. And so 1 in 4 folks who are capable of pregnancy will have had an abortion in their life. That means that likely in your home, in your family, in your small workplace, you know multiple people who have or will have an abortion. 60% of those folks, 60% of people who have abortions are already parents. When we look at the age distribution, the majority of folks who are seeking abortion are in their 20s, but really it spans from early adolescent to much older. So the youngest person I've ever taken care of was 9, and the oldest I've ever taken care of was 52. So it is people across the age spectrum who need and seek abortion services. Most do identify as heterosexual. Most also identify with some religious affiliation. Really importantly, look at that top right bubble, 75% identify as having financial insecurity. Why is that important? Because when we are on the front line of a $15 minimum wage, which I will just throw in my own personal opinion is not a living wage, but it's better, $15 an hour, we as reproductive justice advocates have to be on the front line of that fight. 34% of folks who seek abortion from this data pool were identified as white, 28% is Black, and 25% is Hispanic. So what this really demonstrates for you is there isn't a single person who needs or seeks abortion. And so there isn't a single issue. This isn't a single issue that is deserving of our attention. We really need to be present in all of these spaces.
I hate this map. Okay, so if Roe, so as we were saying, Roe v. Wade it is the landmark Supreme Court ruling that is based in privacy rights, but once they made the ruling, it basically decriminalized access to abortion in the entire country. It had a little additional language talking about reasonable restrictions that has been the bane of my existence. But basically right now, despite some valiant efforts in 48 years of activism, we are looking at a Supreme Court with a majority that does not believe or agree with, rather, the Roe v. Wade decision. The Roberts Court is looking to gut Roe, most likely to throw abortion rights back to the states. And the only question that they currently are contemplating is which of the many, like over 20 direct challenges to Roe that are coming from state legislatures that they want to take. There's a lot of fight left to be had, and I know I don't just speak for myself when I say I'm prepared to go to the wall for Roe, which is not a perfect ruling. But if Roe falls, we have to organize to make sure that people who want and need abortions can still have abortions in the United States. My understanding is that 21 states have laws that would likely be used to restrict legal access to abortion. 9 states have really strong unenforced pre-Roe abortion bans that would kick into gear. So when we look at states that have passed laws that protect access to abortion, you'll often hear people talk about it as codifying Roe. Then we are talking about Illinois recently. New York State was advancing, and obviously there are several states on the coast that have really good protections. But when you look at this map, what we are looking at is the Midwest and the South being very challenging when it comes to the loss of Roe, and the impact would be huge. I think it's important to note that the loss of clinic-based legal abortion care does not come with the automatic risk of death. A lot has changed since 1973, and the biggest risk when Roe falls is that somebody will go to jail, that we will have criminalization, and many states already have laws that would criminalize providing an abortion. When somebody is taking medication abortion without a physician outside of medical care, they are the abortion provider and they would go to jail. So it is very important that people know that advocates are working very hard to make sure that we don't see the kind of horrific medical outcomes that are still happening all over the world, but are not happening in this country because of clinic-based care. But if Roe fell, we would definitely see people being incarcerated, and in some states facing the death penalty for abortion.
So with that really sunshine view of where we are, I'm just going to put this one back up there to remind folks that there is a solution to that bleak perspective, right? And the solution is engaging ourselves, putting ourselves directly square sort of inside all of the justice movements that impact abortion access and the ability and sort of choice to expand our families or not. I know we went a little bit over, so we are going to take some questions here at the end. But I really love this quote from Audre Lorde, who says, "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." And nothing could be more true than that. I'm reminded of that every single day with every single patient that I see. And just a couple of resources. These are some of our favorites that can help sort of develop your understanding and knowledge around reproductive justice and intersectionality. There are certainly many, many, many more, but these are some of our favorites. So we're going to stop there. And then if there are some questions or thoughts, we'd be happy to answer those now. So I think there's both intersections with criminal justice reform and with climate justice.
Sorry.
So I'll give one of my examples about climate justice. So we here in St. Louis have an area in North. Oh, she wants us to talk about criminal justice. Okay, I'm going to do my climate justice. You do criminal justice.
Okay.
So we have an area here in North St. Louis that has basically a burning nuclear waste area. And so children and family living in proximity have been sick for a long time. And despite consistent advocacy by the leaders of that local area, it continues to be a problem. That is a reproductive justice issue because obviously families are not healthy living in that space, but have no other option but to be subjected to that. So that's one example of how climate justice interacts with reproductive justice. Pamela, do you want to give a criminal justice example?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, I really was amazed in 2006 when I learned all of the different ways that people are denied access to reproductive health care and justice simply because they are within the criminal justice system. Everything from shackling people who are incarcerated during childbirth to, and I mean shackling them through the entire process, labor. We have had advocates who have had to go to court in order for people who are within the criminal justice system to access abortion. And it is really quite horrific when you think about some of the ways that the state intercedes on medical decisions that individuals made with their provider. I met a woman in 2006 who was denied custody of her children and was put into a legal battle because she had decided to have a vaginal birth after a C-section, and somebody at the hospital called a judge, and they had a hearing in a medical operating room. And that's certainly not a super common happening, but people being thrown into jail for drug use, which is a public health issue, is very common. For example, I'm in Illinois, and where marijuana is legal, and in Missouri it's not. And there are people who get looped into the criminal justice system for taking a pregnancy test, where even though they would not be facing charges if they actually were caught with the weed. So there's so many overlapping ways in which the criminal justice system is used to deny people their reproductive rights. Okay, the next question, I'm gonna be Oprah right now. Next question. Dr. Colleen, what drove you to seek your medical degree knowing providing abortions would be a main part of it?
So this is a much longer story than we have time for, but the short version is I actually thought that abortion would be a small part, a part of all of the reproductive health care that I gave. I was definitely, and I feel like I could say this because I'm calling myself this, but I was definitely one of those sort of like crunch nugget OBGYNs, vaginal birth for everybody, you bring your doula, sort of holistic approach to sexual reproductive health care. And I thought that abortion would be part of the care that I offered to all of my patients. Little did I know that I actually would sort of evolve into a space where abortion was a main focus of my my practice. And I will say that happened out of necessity and out of learning what was the reality for abortion access and reproductive health and rights and justice in the state of Missouri. And so I did my training here in Missouri, and so was constantly bombarded by abortion laws and restrictions. And really the thing that sort of at my core infuriated me was that there was a complete disregard for scientific fact and evidence. And I just found that so appalling and offending to the like hundreds of thousands of dollars in many years I spent into educating myself to be a physician. And so that's sort of how I evolved into this space. And, at the end of the day, I feel like, I can be that voice for folks who don't have a voice. And so if I can, then I must. And I think that principle sort of guides me in lots of spaces in my life.
Thank goodness.
My wife doesn't think that way. She's not as grateful as you, Pamela.
I'll have to give her a pep talk.
So there was a question in the chat. Curious if you have any recommendations for professional groups that healthcare providers can join to stay up to date on these topics.
I have a whole list of folks, organizations. Emily, maybe I can shoot it to you offline and we can post it, or we can provide it sort of some other way. But yeah, there are definitely a whole host of organizations. Medical Students for Choice is a great
That's right. Definitely pass that on we have chapters all over the country. And actually we are an international organization. So we have chapters in 28 countries in the world, but most of them are in the United States. And Physicians for Reproductive Health is phenomenal. Yeah, so I would just say that, I would not be doing this work if I did not believe that this is really the path to building a better world where people can thrive and enjoy their lives, and that's basically the world I want to live in. So even though I gave the gloom and doom on the Supreme Court, the arc does bend towards justice, and I firmly believe that. Ultimately, we will win. And if you need something to be inspired by, just look at some of the activism and expansion of abortion rights that we've seen in South America, and obviously the awesome work that was done in Ireland. So we are on the side of justice, and proud to be in that work with all of you and with Colleen.
Thanks, Pamela. And I will just conclude with a challenge. The next time you are present in another justice space, I challenge you to bring up a reproductive health issue, bring up a birthing issue, bring up an abortion issue, bring up a contraception issue, find a way to bring something about sexual and reproductive health and that justice lens of reproductive justice to another issue.
Hear, hear.
Well, thank you for that inspiring and encouraging message that we can go forward with tonight. Thank you all who attended and stayed on with us a little bit. Again, if you have more questions that you'd like us to address, we'd love to continue these discussions even beyond the upcoming course that Pamela and Colleen are teaching. So you can certainly send them to us at the AHA. We got another thank you for this. So again, thank you. And we'll put this recording up publicly. I do want to remind folks that if you enjoyed this program and you have attended any of our other programs, we would love to have you join the American Humanist Association and donate to support more programming like this. Especially, we love to be able to provide them for free for folks, but we do like to also support our speakers for their work and would like to appreciate them. So have a good night and thank you all for joining.